G'day everybody, my name is Paul McCarty. I am that good looking guy right there. I am the CEO of SecureStack. SecureStack is a startup based in Australia. Now I might not sound Australian, that's because I'm not. I'm from Detroit, but I've lived most of my life in Utah. I met an Australian girl and I moved to Australia in 2016 and I started SecureStack in 2017. We are based on the lovely Gold Coast in Queensland. I'm there with my wife and my 3 kids. And my team is on the Gold Coast with me there. I have been in the game a long time. Don't let the baby face fool you. I've been in the game 31 years this year. I know, surprising, right? 31 years. I started out in the early 90s. And I started out originally as a Unix admin, right? Way back in the Sun OS days. And somehow quickly found myself in an early burgeoning Linux kind of firewall and security space. And my career has gone on, as I'm sure all your careers have done, in the varying pivots and ticks and tacks. I spent roughly about half of my career working for large organizations, and the other half of my career working for startups, including my own. Well, actually, including multiple of my own. And I've seen the challenges we're going to talk about today, both for those larger organizations and for those smaller organizations. My specialty nowadays, or before I started SecureStack, was helping organizations, like some of the ones you see up there, build secure application infrastructure at scale. So I was an early proponent of Puppet and Ansible and things like that, like I'm sure many of you were. And that really kind of changed my career. It allowed us to take deployment times for applications from when I was at Blue Cross Blue Shield with one of our main applications. The deployment would typically start at 9 o'clock on a Friday, and all those suckers that were on call that weekend would all be on that crappy phone call, right, for hours, right, until the DBAs at the end of this long, complicated process deploy the database changes, and hopefully, you crossed your fingers and the database gods were happy and it all worked. And that typically would take 7 or 8 hours through the middle of the night, which sucked, especially after you had kids and families and regular lives, which most of us did. And then something like Ansible or Puppet came along and allowed us to take that whole night process with like 20-some people and bring it down to an hour with 2 people. And that changed my career, and that's my jam. So we're here today to talk about the DevSecOps Playbook. It's a little thing that I wrote, and it comes out of my background in building DevOps, and now I don't want to say DevOps and DevSecOps teams because that's really not what they should call the teams, but that's where we are, right? How many people in the room right now have worked for a DevOps team? Anybody? 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, maybe. I'm not going to fight that battle. There's many battles that are not worth fighting. That ain't one of them. The issue, though, is that we have a problem, and we still have that same problem after many years. And the DevSecOps Playbook was my attempt at coming up with a solution for myself. And ultimately, that solution is something that I could then expose to other people, and that's what I've done. Basically, the DevSecOps Playbook started out as a list of tasks that organically grew as my career progressed over the last 10 years or whatever, and grew and grew and grew, and kind of spanned a wide variety of roles in the industry that now we kind of bundled together as this thing called DevSecOps. The DevSecOps Playbook is really about building a minimally viable baseline for y'all, for you, specific for you and your applications and your teams. As I said, I've been doing this for a long time, and the problem hasn't really gotten a ton better over the last 20 years. You can make arguments that in some places it has, but the problem ultimately comes down to the fact that humans are humans, and we say that we want to collaborate and work together, but ultimately we often don't, right? Why? Because I have my own territory and my own things. I have my own toys and I don't want to play with them. But unfortunately, after all these years, we still kind of have a problem with deploying secure applications. Now, I said earlier that I've worked a lot with startups and enterprise. Something I want to say early on is that I built the DevSecOps Playbook to be usable by any size organization, right? The requirements for those different organizations are really different, right? It just makes sense. Startup is going to have very different requirements than enterprise. Enterprise will have issues around compliance and other things that startups really don't think about because they are concerned about surviving. Startups often, especially the smaller they are concerned about simply surviving. So for them, if you're like compliance or surviving, which one are they going to choose, right? So the DevSecOps Playbook had to take that into account. They have different types of teams. Enterprises have security teams and operations teams and engineering teams. Startups usually have a ton of developers and maybe one security person and not very many ops people at all. It's just kind of standard makeup of the average startup. But regardless of how they are laid out, I wanted the DevSecOps Playbook to map to all of them. So the evidence of the problem, I picked 4, but if given time, I probably could come up with like 1,000, right? But evidence of the problem is that because the cloud has come along and given developers, I should probably not move around because of video, huh? You got me? Cool, sweet. I'm gonna do the Eddie Murphy, right? Back and forth. So the software engineering teams often have direct access to the cloud. And for enterprise organizations, you might have controls around that. You might have guardrails around that. But I can tell you for startups and scale-ups, they don't. They absolutely do not. Or typically they don't. Which means that the engineers who often don't have a background in security or operations have unfettered access to the cloud. Unfortunately, InfoSec teams have not joined the DevOps kind of mandate and culture, right? And that's a problem. And we'll talk about that a little bit later. And the reality is that we're deploying faster than we ever have before. When I was at Blue Cross Blue Shield and we deployed that monolithic app once a month or once a quarter, that's ancient, that's archaic right now. One of our startups at SecureStack deploys over 80 times a day to prod, right? Once a month or once a quarter versus 80 times a day. Can anybody in the room, by the way, I want this to be interactive. So if you disagree with me, if you got a question, please shout those out. I like interacting with the audience. That's kind of my preferred way to do this. But has anybody in the room today seen somebody deploy more than 80 times a day? That's not Google. That's a lot, huh? So that changes the model that we have to use, right? And finally, this idea, there's this weird kind of thing that's like, if containers or serverless are only around for a minute or 10 minutes or whatever it is, this short period of time, that we don't have to secure them, right? A great example of that is that I commonly see when I look at a workload, g'day mate, when I look at a workload, the container that is being used or the runtime that's being used for that process is old, right? It's not ancient, but it ain't new. And that's a problem, right? We have this idea that if something's going to be short-lived as part of a CI/CD pipeline or whatever the case may be, that we don't have to secure it, and that's a problem. So I know I'm not going to bludgeon you with statistics, but the reality is that in this environment where security hasn't joined the DevOps kind of movement, and where engineers are able to often deploy to the cloud directly, we just have a lot of problems that come out of that, right? That number, 96% of cloud breaches being self-inflicted, that's actually a lot higher. It's 99% now. So the reality is that what we're doing now is just kind of sprawl, right? It's just sprawl at scale. So let's talk about why we're in this position that we are today. So first and foremost, we have to assume, who in this room started out as a software engineer? Oh, boo, yes. Like it. Software engineers provide value to the business in the form of features and functionality, right? And because of that, security is always a third or distant, it's not going to be up there, right? It just is. That's the reality of it. Because software engineering teams are building and deploying functionality as quickly as possible. The security is a bolt-on at the end. So we understand why this is, because the business wants these features that allows the business to build revenue and new market streams and all those kind of things they do. But imagine if we incentivized, let's say, bus drivers in the same way that we incentivize software engineers. If we said to bus drivers, hey, the most important thing about your job is to get from the beginning of your route to the end of your route as quickly as possible. Probably not going to work out very well, right? Boom, hyperbole. The reality is that's what we're doing with software engineering teams, right? We say, hey, move as quickly as possible. And then we wonder why, sometimes the applications they build, are not up to the security kind of mandate that we want. So that was software engineering teams. InfoSec. InfoSec has not moved towards the center like many of us did during the DevSecOps revolution. That's just a reality, right? Security as code and many of these concepts are illusions, or often are illusions. They didn't really happen. And that's a problem. InfoSec didn't evolve to join the DevOps revolution, and so guess what? We're still bolting security on 10, 15, 20 years later. Evidence of that problem is that many InfoSec teams to this day, I live in Australia, and I can't tell you like the number of security questionnaires I've gotten in the last year that when I look at them, I'm like, oh my God, I got the same security questionnaire 20 years ago, right? Like, it hasn't changed. Who's gotten a security questionnaire in the last year? How much did you love it? You loved it, right? It's an antiquated, ancient, inefficient system. And yet, InfoSec teams, especially large organizations, continue to rely on this ancient, antiquated mechanism. They're also still focused on the edge, and they haven't really kind of aligned themselves with the cloud strategy. I see this all the time when I'm dealing with customers in Australia, less in the US, but definitely in Australia, where you talk to the InfoSec team about the data center, and they've got controls, they got intrusion detection, and all the things that we typically have. But when you talk about the cloud infrastructure, yeah, we ain't got that. It's like, wait, hold on. For your data center, you've got these controls, but for your cloud VMs, you don't? Why not? Well, because we didn't really have the tooling, and there's a bunch of excuses, and that's kind of where we are. The security tooling is often siloed, right? A security team will buy something that's supposed to be for the development teams, but then they hold on to it. My precious, right? My precious. I was interviewing a customer during customer discovery about a year ago, and I said to him, what kind of security tools are your engineers using typically day to day? Like, oh no, we don't let them do that. Oh, why not? Oh, because we do that in the CI/CD pipeline. Oh, okay, cool. So what kind of stuff are you doing there? Oh, I don't really know. Why not? Because that's owned by that other group, right? And that's common, and that's a problem. This stuff needs to be shared across these security tools, and these solutions and these processes need to be shared across the organization. And because of this, or maybe this is partly the problem, is that enterprise organizations globally have right-sized InfoSec. And so InfoSec kind of has, my perspective is that they are where they are because they've been right-sized down to effectively an ineffective sized organization, right, department. That's really what it comes down to. But I see DevSecOps as an opportunity to bring InfoSec into the fold, to work with them and do that in a truly collaborative way. And finally, operations. For cloud and startups, operations teams have been effectively devalued, right? That's just the truth of it. When I talk to many scale-ups, so we're talking about 100 to 200 head companies, they effectively don't have an operations team, right? They really don't. They certainly don't have one that interacts with their cloud team. Now, they might have a small cloud ops team, which is effectively sysadmin for the AWS or the Azure infrastructure. But it's unfortunate that ops has been devalued in the modern world, in the modern web app world, and that kind of leads to where we are now. So one way that we say to fix this is DevSecOps. DevSecOps is going to fix this, right? But the reality is that, what is DevSecOps? Is it a team? What is it? And there's a bunch of vendors that will tell you what their version of DevSecOps is, right? Which is often a tiny little bit of testing in your CI/CD pipeline, and it's DevSecOps, right? I'm good. You can't just change the name of your team to the DevSecOps team, which is what happened to me in 2016. Before they just changed the name of the team, right? And it's like, we're good. Yeah, that's not it either. We really need to truly embed those security and operations functions within the software development process. I think pretty much we all kind of get that, right? So let's go on from there. So what I wanted to build was this nirvana. I wanted to build a playbook that could be used for any size organization, right? Whether they're a startup of 10 people, a scale-up of 200 people, or an enterprise of 10,000 people. Now, also, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, the way that those different kinds of organizations work means that the playbook has to have a couple of things in it that allows you to, like, it makes it mailable, right? It makes it modifiable. And so something I thought about is that each of these things on this playbook should be prioritized. In other words, like, this is something you should do first. When you're done with all those things, go on to the next set of things, right? And it should also be sorted by difficulty, right? So you understand what's my ROI in implementing this particular task. And by the way, throughout this, I'm gonna try as much as I can to refer to these as tasks, not as controls, because I don't see them as controls. My personal requirements is that I needed a simple checklist, right? If I'm in a small startup, here's the things that I can do. If I'm an enterprise, here's the things that I can do. I wanted to focus heavily on DevSecOps and collaboration, and I wanted to build in compliance requirements because I didn't want to deal with those stupid questionnaires anymore, right? I just wanted to get rid of that. I wanted to have, I wanted, when InfoSec came to the team, I wanted the question they were about to ask to already be answered. I wanted you to have someplace you could go and already answer that. And I also wanted to build a way to pull those teams into this mindset, this DevSecOps mindset. So I wrote it specifically in a way that could be approachable by people that had a traditional InfoSec or system admin kind of operations background. My requirements, there's so many requirements, I made 2 of them. How do I bring the InfoSec teams into this? But also, how do I make AppSec a first-class citizen inside of InfoSec? And this is something I'm going to touch on a little bit later, but I want to mention it now. AppSec often is not really fully brought into the InfoSec teams, at least in the enterprise world, right? Sometimes they're owned by engineering groups, and sometimes they're owned by InfoSec, but they always seem to be kind of their own thing. And that's I see that as a problem. I want to bring that AppSec capability into the fold. I've already said I wanted to address those security questionnaires. I also wanted to increase CI/CD and automation maturity, because the reality is that when I talk to customers, like, oh yeah, we got CI/CD pipelines, we got all that. And when you look into it, the maturity of those pipelines is often greatly overestimated or exaggerated in some cases. So let's talk for a second about a questionnaire. This is actually a questionnaire from an organization that was bringing me in to actually do many of the things that they were asking me here if I did, right? So, for example, what secure coding framework do you reference when developing software? They had literally brought me in to help them build that, right? And it just shows you what kind of a ridiculous thing these questionnaires are. You're asking for a vendor to do things that you yourself don't do, right? But at the same time, it's part of our process. So how do we build in the ability to interact with that into something like the DevSecOps Playbook? I kind of compiled all the questionnaires that I'd gotten over the last several years and kind of figured out the standard questions they asked. But then I went a step further. I actually reached out to, we have some partners in cyber insurance and brokers, and I asked them, hey, can you send me all the questionnaires for all the cyber insurance companies, right? So when you're signing up from all the things they ask you. And so I got 10 or 12 of these things, and I did the same thing there. I kind of collated all of them back together. And then what I had is I had this list of about 50-some things that are the most typical questions, right? Are you running antivirus or EDR, right? You know, if it says, are you running antivirus, you know they haven't updated this security questionnaire in about 10 years, right? Are you using MFA, which is hilarious because many large organizations to this day still aren't using MFA. But it's the typical kind of stuff. And so this list of 50 things, 50 requirements, were things that I had in my mind, right? I wanted to address. And specifically around, just to drill into it a little bit more, specifically questions on the questionnaires that had to do with the software development lifecycle, right? Or the end-to-end application environment. So here's some documents and organizations that I've drawn inspiration from, right? Is everybody familiar with the minimal viable secure product? All right, this came out about a year and a half ago. I'm actually on the working group for this. The MVSP, and the website is mvsp.dev. It's a great document. It's relatively straightforward and simple. And basically what the MVSP does is it says, this is a baseline that you can use as an IT person to know that the person you're about to buy something from or interact with has done what's minimally viable to be acceptable at a security level, right? The SSDF, I'm sure most of you probably have heard about the SSDF. The SSDF is a large and sprawling document, and I have mad respect for it, but it also isn't, contrary to the name, it's not actually the kind of document that engineering teams or actual foot soldiers can kind of comprehend and deal with, right? The ASVS is one of the best ones out there, and I'm not just saying that because I'm at a OWASP conference and I have to drink the Kool-Aid, but the reality is the ASVS is a very prescriptive and large and accessible document, and I only recently kind of became aware of the ASVS within the last year, so actually it predates my introduction to ASVS predates when I wrote the first version of the playbook. But then there's also Timo Padgel's DevSecOps maturity model, the DSOM, which is a great document, and I was aware of that when I wrote the playbook. And the DSOM is cool, and it's got like multiple maturity levels inside of it, 3 of them, but it's also written in language that's, I think, supposed to be more approachable by managers rather than foot soldiers, the people, the day-to-day people. Oh, and something I forgot to say is, I'm a doer, right? I'm a CEO of a company, but I'm a doer. I still write code. I still do a lot of the QA in my organization. Maybe that's because I like to get too involved in those things, but the reality is that's what I really enjoy. And so when I built this playbook, I wrote it for a specific audience, and that specific audience is people that do technical things. The audience for this is engineers. It's a very prescriptive document. So all of those and several others that I didn't have time to put in the slide acted as inspiration. But the reason I wrote my own document is because none of those actually gave me kind of what I was looking for. So before we talk about DevSecOps, let's talk for a second about application security. Because after all, we're at an OWASP conference, right? Open Web Application Security Project. Yeah, I was forgetting the P. Why do we want to talk about application security? Because frankly, I didn't want to write an AppSec document. What I'm trying to do is different. I'm trying to build a playbook that will help, or a document that will help organizations build a cross-departmental DevSecOps methodology. But to understand how to do that, you kind of have to understand the difference between AppSec and DevSecOps. Now this definition here, this is mine. That's kind of me stealing 2 or 3 other people's definitions, but I think what's important about application security is that it's typically actually a role. It's actually something that people do, right? Their job is to provide application security tasks for an organization. It's a process of adding and developing and testing security features throughout the application development process, to prevent threats and vulnerabilities. But it's important to concentrate on the fact that it's different than DevSecOps, because DevSecOps is a process. It's like a methodology. It's not a team. Whereas an AppSec typically is thought of, AppSec is typically thought of as a team. By the way, this is my interpretation. You guys can disagree, because guess what? We all get to have our own opinions, right? It's kind of like armpits and hair. We all get our own. AppSec teams tend to be staffed primarily by people that started out as software engineers. that's kind of the standard. They typically have not come from a SecOps or system admin background, but that's not always the case. They concentrate on specifically the software testing and secure coding practices. Super important. They concentrate more on the application itself and testing that application than they do on the application environment. And the tools they use, the scope, I mean, this is different for every organization, but the reality is that most of the time it involves the kind of immediate tools and solutions and platforms that the software engineering teams are using. And the tooling tends to be SCA, software composition analysis, static analysis, and dynamic and sometimes dynamic application testing. You guys get to choose your own definition of AppSec. This is not Paul's way or is the only way. That's after many years working with AppSec teams. That's my feeling of how to describe them. OWASP does have an amazing document. I only came across this about 9 months ago. Has an amazing document about how to build an AppSec program. So if any of you are interested, I highly recommend checking that out. It's really cool. It kind of breaks it's similar to a document that I've got in my head floating around right now about how I break down helping organizations like build out DevSecOps based on the playbook. So I highly recommend checking out that doc. All right, so what is DevSecOps? We talked a little bit about AppSec. What is DevSecOps? It automates the integration of security at every phase of the SDLC. And I should really replace the SDLC, software development lifecycle, which is the application environment, right? From initial design all the way through integration, testing, deployment, and the monitoring of that, which is typically monitoring and things like at the far right of the lifecycle tend not to be inside of the kind of AppSec world. DevSecOps is a portmanteau of developers, security and operations teams, and that's exactly what it should be. So I'm going to take a second here to be a little bit, not combative, but challenging. DevSecOps is not, the vendors don't get to define it, right? Gartner, sorry if anybody works for Gartner here, but Gartner doesn't get to define DevSecOps. Your organization does, right? The reality is that it really started out as a collaboration. It was supposed to be a collaboration like DevOps was, and unfortunately it's been co-opted to mean buzzwords, right? A little bit of CI/CD stuff, whiz bang, and we're good, DevSecOps. So I want us to concentrate on the fact that it's really about collaborating with those organizations, because ultimately at the end of this, the business value that we get out of DevSecOps is a better, more functioning and secure application and application environment, which is good for all of us, right? So, some of the DevSecOps primitives. It includes team members with more diverse backgrounds. That's the first thing. When I got to build we didn't call it DevSecOps, by the way. We called it the platform team, right? That was platform team. That would have been that was kind of popular between 2012 and 2015, somewhere in there. The platform team at Blue Cross Blue Shield included multiple people from QA. It included people from the security teams. It included people from the middleware teams and several others. And so I've actually gotten to see it work as a truly collaborative thing, and it changed the way that we built and deployed applications at that organization. So I've seen it work. The perspective, the concentration is really on testing and deployment across the whole of that application environment. So it's not just about testing the application code and the way that you test that before it gets deployed. It's about that whole end-to-end process. And a lot more concentration on deployment and how things actually run and the runtime and whatnot. The scope for DevSecOps is that it focuses on that whole SDLC rather than the far left. Now, I'm sure we've all heard shift left, right? Has anybody not, no, nobody's going to answer this, right? Has anybody not heard about shift left? Funny guy. I believe shifting left is super important. Like it is, it's super important, but we need to be shifting everywhere, right? And that's what collaboration with those teams and finding those champions, finding those people to connect with, that's what that allows us to do. And And the tools that typically are used for CI/CD, and again, every organization gets to define this themselves, but tends to be CI/CD and deployment focused. And the security tools are more broadly based, right? Infrastructure as code, scanning tools, and other things that aren't typically going to be part of an AppSec process. And this word right here, that word needs to have more love, right? Monitoring of the applications. We need to spend more time doing that because you don't really know what the baseline is, what the normal operating perspective of an application is until you monitor it. And I feel like in today's highly iterative space, we don't spend enough time thinking about the monitoring of our applications. What's important about DevSecOps is the outcome. The outcomes that I'm looking for are that the team members who will already be subject matter experts in some portion of the application environment. But as being part of this DevSecOps kind of mindset, they will understand other aspects of that environment and be able to perform some of those functions. That's super important. We'll be able to perform some of those functions. One of the things that made the DevOps transformation for me so powerful is I started acting like security and developers. What do I mean by that? Well, I started doing things like checking all my scripts into version control, right? Versioning them, sharing those, and interacting. It wasn't just Paul's repo, it was the team's repo, right? I actually got involved with how do you deploy and manage the security tools. Up until that point, that was not my thing, that was somebody else's thing. Remember that picture from the 90s where somebody's throwing a javelin over the wall, and there's somebody on the other side of the wall? You remember that? I had that on my cubicle wall. As I started to work with those teams, and one of the ways that I did that is that my boss came and tapped me on the shoulder in 2001 and said, "Hey, do you want to go work with the security team for 6 months?" I'm a Unix admin. I had a background in some security firewall stuff, as I mentioned earlier. And I said, yeah, sure. So I went and actually worked. This is 2001. I worked with the security and also in the NOC too as well. And that changed my career. It changed my trajectory. And it made me more broad and diverse across that set of functional requirements. And I think that's ultimately what I want to get out of this. So a reminder, I'm trying to help my teams work more collaborative. I'm not trying to build an AppSec team. So I'm not trying to make an argument of AppSec versus DevSecOps. That's not what I'm trying to do. I'm just trying to say, what I'm trying to do here is I'm trying to create a more collaborative environment. All right, how do you start a DevSecOps program? There's a lot of words up here, so I apologize. I will paraphrase. Effectively, what I suggest, and I've got a whole process that I help when I was contracting and consulting. I did this for people, and I still do this for companies with SecureStack on occasion. But I spend a month or two kind of identifying all the applications, right? I identify who owns those applications. I map those applications to different people and teams, to production and what have you. And once you kind of build that mapping, you quickly figure out, because what you're doing is when you're building out that mapping, you're calling up somebody and saying, hey, Arthur, what are the applications that you interact with on a weekly basis? Bing, 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 bing. What are the applications you work with on a quarterly basis? Bing and bing. You begin to build this mapping. Arthur knows about these, Paul knows about these. Once you figure that out, as part of that process, you've probably figured out who some of the champions are you can reach out to, right? And it's really important to early on figure out who those natural champions are. And at Blue Cross Blue Shield, I was one of those champions because I was genuinely interested in working with the InfoSec teams. Figure out who the doers are, because life is built into two types of people, doers and not doers. Figure out who the doers are and then bring them into the fold. Prioritize, make it a priority of your company. Find a way to evangelize that and align that with business value. In Australia, that's really easy right now because all of Australia is freaking out about the Optus and Medibank hacks. See, this is cool, man. I see some nodding here. This is crazy that a tiny little country like Australia, our big hack, which by the way affects about 40% of our population, 40%, right? One telco, it's our number 2 telco too. If it had been Telstra, which is our number 1, it would be even more. But then recently Medibank, which is our largest private insurer in Australia, was also hacked. And literally every single customer record of theirs, almost 4 million people, They were in there for months. They were in there so long at Medibank. They built up this really cool tool to pull stuff out of the database, break it. Did anybody else read about this? To break it up into chunks, and oh my God, like they were in there so long, they got to optimize. You know when the bad guys have been in your network too long, that they got a chance to optimize, right? Do my Eddie Murphy again. In Australia right now, it's really easy for me to evangelize DevSecOps because right now, a bunch of people have, like my mother-in-law, she's freaking out. She's got to get a new passport and she's got to get a new driver's license. Like, oh, Paul, how do I do this? It's like, okay, there's processes. They're gonna, you don't have to pay for it now. They're gonna do it for you. But 40% of Australia is in the same boat, and so it's easy for me to evangelize that stuff. So figure out who are the relevant teams you need to collaborate with, and start to build those relationships with them, right? And I know this is all that highfalutin stuff. We all kind of know this at some level, but the reality is that building those networking opportunities is really important. But then also building collateral to give them, to interact with them is super important. One of the things that I did when I was at Blue Cross Blue Shield is I started building out templates in VMware to make the InfoSec team's job easier. And just by that, reaching out to them and saying, hey, what are the things that you need to embed in the average Windows or Linux image was a way for me to create that relationship, right? And by creating that template for them, I created collateral that they could then use. They could build documentation around that, right? But it required that I reach out to them. And that's part of the, if you want this to be successful, we have to do. And finally, quantify what success looks like, right? And to me, I've found ways with my team, because I'm doing this right now, I've found ways to say, hey, if you do these certain functions, if you hit these, and it's not like if you hit 80% of this, that's not the way to do it. You say, hey, if all of our applications are deployed into prod with MFA working and these other things working, here's a KPI around it. We don't call it a KPI at Secure Stack, right? But choose KPIs that don't suck, right? I think that's the important thing. All right, so when I was thinking about this document, I'm like, oh man, how do I build this document? I'm thinking about it, and I took the famous, this is my art, right? I took the famous Infinity logo. Everybody's seen the famous DevSecOps, DevOps Infinity logo, right? And I started mapping out the kind of enterprise grade tasks, and I quickly ran out of space. I was like, what do I do? What do I do? Do I make a second ring around there? How do I do this? There's a lot of things. So then I said, now let me lay it out. Let me lay out the DevSecOps kind of life cycle in a linear line, and let me start to layer the tasks in there, right? And this is the first iteration of what I came up with. And basically this is broken down into tasks that are owned by developers, tasks that are owned by operations, and tasks that are owned by InfoSec. But as part of doing that, I'm effectively underscoring the fact that these should be different groups with different ownership, right? So one way that I kind of thought, like, how do I make these tasks? How do I affect for or adjust for the fact that different people from different teams will sometimes do those? So I added this security domain. So basically what this says is that people that kind of do development type stuff will own the green stuff, right? And people that kind of own the cloud ops and operations will do the kind of orange stuff. You see how big that is? It's really big, right? Very expansive, very broad. And people that own the kind of security stuff will do this stuff. And I forgot to put anything in that column, but that's okay. It's a work in progress. And I realized when I came up with this, whatever number this is like 30 or whatever number of tasks this is, I thought, there's still a lot here. My page, I'm gonna have to change the aspect ratio to not be landscape. I'll have to go to portrait mode. And I thought, well, that's not cool. But then the other problem was when I took the first version of the DevSecOps Playbook to some of my startup customers, they're like, we don't have any security people. And I thought, I knew that, but I didn't account for it, right? Why did I put all that stuff there that they don't have anybody to do, right? And it got me thinking, that's where I realized that this needs to be malleable. This needs to be flexible enough for any size organization, any type of organization to do, to implement. So one size does not fit all. So I thought about this and I thought, well, let me just create a document that has a set of domains. Oh yeah, real quick. What's different for startups versus enterprise? Obviously, startups have a different size team. They tend not to have subject matter experts in security or operations. Not always the case, but often that's the case, especially with smaller ones. They're definitely driven by developers. Most of the startups that I work with, unlike who here works in who here identifies or says they work in an enterprise organization? Okay, maybe a third, a quarter. Can a developer deploy something directly to prod in your environment? We got a yes. We got some no's. If the answer is yes, hold up your hand. If they can okay. I'm not a bad guy, so you can be honest. With startups, typically software engineers can deploy anything, and that means there's a lot of sprawl because they're deploying development environments and whatnot. But you have to account for that. And the reality is that when they're deploying to the cloud, there's often not a lot of real understanding about infrastructure, right? There's not a lot of experience there. So maybe we can use the DevSecOps Playbook as a way to address that. So let's break it down into, instead of like, plan, write, test, build, deploy, all those kind of very formulaic things. Let's break it down instead into domains of ownership. Let's add that prioritization system that I talked about. What you should do first, right? What are the hardest things to do, and how do you define that ROI around it? Let's build that into as well. So let's show the bloody repo, Paul. Let's see if I can do this here. So all this is a GitHub repo. And you can go to GitHub. Oh boy. I'm going to pull this over here because I'm breaking my neck. There you go. Ooh, yeah. All right, cool. Here it is. This is version 1.2 of the document. I've worked with about 8 people so far to build this document out. And a couple of those people in particular have been really, really important to me. A guy named Cole Cornford. If we're videoing this, right? Hey, Cole, shout out to you, buddy. Those people have kind of like, been my test as I've written this, because I wrote the first version of it entirely by myself and then gave it to my friends and then got a bunch of responses back. But ultimately, the playbook is broken down, as I said, into these domains right here. And those domains are the development environment, the source code management, continuous improvement and automation, deployment, and I don't like this, so I need some help with what to call this, organizational techniques. I hate the word techniques, so I'm crowdsourcing a better way to define that. So if you've got any ideas, please come and hit me. I'll be out on the expo floor. But there's also an addendum for compliance, right? And what that looks like, there's my image there. Each one of those sections is broken down into anywhere between 8 and 20 different tasks. So if we look here in the development environment list, domain, you can see something like secure code training, using git ignores, using pre-commit hook scans. You can see a description right here. A pre-commit hook for security scans provides timely feedback to engineers and helps to prevent vulnerable code from being introduced to a repository. This column right here, describes the priority. So something that's a priority 1 is something you should do right away. So anything that's in column, that's priority 1, go through. If you want to, start to implement some of these things, go through the DevSecOps Playbook. Implement the things that are number 1, and then circle back when you've done all those and start doing the things that are number 2s. And then when you're done with those, come back and circle back to the number 3s. There's only 1, 2, and 3s. Also, here's that column for how difficult something. Most of these things are easy. Secure code training, that's a little bit more difficult. That involves people. teams and whatnot. But something else that's important, because I always wanted to have a compliance mechanism here, is that we're addressing in this final column the specific frameworks that that particular task, because this is not a control, this is a task, maps to. And me and my team and the group of collaborators that have been working on this have been working on that, and we're working on the next version of this, which won't just list out CIS 8, it'll list out the specific thing that it maps to, right? So that is coming. Actually, most of that work is done already. We're also thinking about implementing, I'm jumping ahead to the next slide, but we're also thinking about implementing a second document, a second markup document that talks about each one of these things in more depth and gives links and video links and stuff like that. But as I scroll down here, you'll see that.
So what was your lens for difficulty again?
The lens for difficulty, good question. It was based on my lens, so first and foremost. So one of the things that's great about this is that you can fork it and you can change it for your lens, but ultimately difficulty was about how long and how many people it took to implement that thing, that task. And that's based on my experience. Again, that's going to probably differ for other people. But the reality is something like, for example, local static code analysis. Now, the reason that I call this out as local is because I believe that static code analysis and some of these scanning technologies should be used at different places. I believe it should be used on as many developer laptops as possible, especially static analysis. Static analysis in particular is not well suited for CI/CD pipelines. Does anybody disagree with that? Did we get a real disagreement? Yeah, right, fair enough.
Yeah, both places.
I think they should too. And actually, an addendum to what I said is I think that you should absolutely run static analysis with specific rule sets, right? That are the problem with static analysis inside of CI/CD is a lot of the output is not Boolean. Like, do you break that? Do you stop that build or not, right? How am I doing for time? Good, 5 more minutes? 10, sweet. The reason I called that easy is because it's pretty easy to go brew, install, semgrep, right? And then you run semgrep, right? That's pretty easy. And it involves one person, to your question, right? Now, if everybody on the team doesn't do that, well, okay, but at least some people have done that, right? And you're getting value out of even some, or even one person doing that, right? So that's how the lens for difficulty works for me. Does that make sense?
Yes.
Cool. The mappings here, you might notice a couple here that are not familiar to you. APRA is it's an Australian compliance framework that applies to organizations that fall under the kind of financial services. You can kind of think about it like as kind of the SEC in a way, sort of, but and also to I don't think is there one there. Also the ISM. We're not a very creative people in Australia, so we name things really kind of. The ISM stands for the Information Security Manual. A very sexy name, I know. But it's actually a really great document. It's written by the Australian Signals Directorate, which is our version of the CIA in Australia. And it's actually, what was that? NSA, right? Sorry, NSA. Did I say CIA? NSA. Thank you. And the ISM has actually got a maturity model into it. It's one of the first documents in the world to introduce a maturity model. It's a very prescriptive, well, some parts of it are prescriptive. Some parts of it not so much. But it's a large document, and they've broken it down into guidelines. Like, for example, a couple years ago, they came out with a secure coding guidelines, which is a subset of the ISM. But anyhow, that's why you might notice a few in there. Otherwise, you should recognize them as CIS and NIST 800 SSDF and so on and so forth. We're also working on putting ASVS and some others in there as well. But if I scroll down to the next section, CI/CD pipelines and automation, right? The reason I broke it out into these domains is because that doesn't necessarily map. Your organization might not let the engineering teams run that. I don't know. Maybe they do, maybe they don't. But the point is that that's up to you guys. So if I don't stick to that formulaic, 8-stage DevSecOps model, lifecycle model, you can adapt this any way you want to. But as you move into these different tasks, they begin. Let me go all the way down to the bottom. to the organizational techniques. Oh, went a little too far. Things like bug bounty and vulnerability disclosure, these are not things that you individually deploy or use, right? These are things that your organization uses. By the way, Optus didn't have either one of those. Might be a problem. But things like sovereignty. Sovereignty is a task in the sense that you need to decide on an application by application, environment by environment way, whether or not you have sovereignty concerns that you need to address, right? And that's why it's in this particular section. And I call out several places where sovereignty is specific mentioned, including ISO 27001 and also 27002. And you'll see things like SIEM and threat modeling, because part of my purpose here was to reach out to security teams and bring them into this, right? So if I include things that are clearly in their space, that brings them into the process. And that was part of the point here. If I scroll back up to deployment, deployment is the biggest one. I think there's 18 different tasks in deployment. Things like encrypt traffic, right? This is a task that you have to implement at multiple places, right? So it's not one thing that's implemented in one place. It's something that's implemented in multiple places. You can do that anyhow in a bunch of different places. The point is, though, is that you should do it. And if you're part of this DevSecOps process at your organization, you should be thinking individually, is there someone that's like, is there some part of my role where I can help to do that? So many of these things are simple. Things like use a valid SSL certificate, right? These are simple things, right? But ultimately, they need to be something that is on that playbook, that you make sure you address for each one of these application environments. And that's why it's on this list. So who's back over here? Wrapping this bad boy up. What does the future hold? Definitely going to add a second markdown page that'll have more details about each particular task. We're going to add that specific mapping. I saw a couple of people nod when I said that. Add more compliance frameworks. We've already got several more that we've got queued up. And add the ability to sort in priority by priority and difficulty. So we're thinking about actually creating a static app that allows you to just sort. You can say, hey, just show me the number ones. Just show me the easy, right? That sounds weird in the mic. Sorry about that. And finally, we're looking to find more collaborators. So my ask today is that if you're interested in helping out with this, it's a public repo. It's been forked. It's been forked a few times. 150. Thank you. Cheers. It's been forked 150 times. Yeah, right on. Got a few stars. But yeah, we're always looking for more people to collaborate. I did this mostly on my own. I didn't do this for a commercial gain. I did this because I needed this and I thought other people would. So if you're interested in joining, please do. And that, my friends, wraps things up today. My name is Paul McCarty, and you can find me here, paulm@securestack.com. I'm on Twitter. I'm kind of cheeky on Twitter, so be prepared. And thanks for taking the time. I appreciate it. Cheers.